Disclaimer. I curse every bit of spoiler I received for both Undertale and Deltarune. Do yourself a favor and play them both before watching this video and ones like it. Ralsei claims in the beginning of chapter 3 that both he and the Dark World are neither real nor to be worried about felt insane to me. They bothered me to no end, and so I began writing the script. Not for a video, but just to gather information on how darkness works, as a basis for future theorizing and, more importantly, to disprove Ralsei's claims. But then it kept growing beyond that point, far and wide into the realm of interpretation and meaning behind the core ideas of both Deltarune and Undertale and how they relate to each other thematically. So let's take a dive into Deltarune's darkness, led by the question of whether or not Ralsei is real. I hope you enjoy. Let's start with a bit of context. Undertale made its characters feel more real than any others by being openly aware of its own nature as a video game, offering in-universe consequences to seemingly out-of-universe actions and showing the player a sociopathic fall to their own power over its world as a final boss. But where Undertale both tightens and blurs the gap between fiction and reality, Deltarune, in particular now chapter 3, seemingly tells you flat out that its characters are just that. Characters. Stop caring so much and go find real friends instead, Ralsei says. Clearly, there seems to be a thematic clash here, and to a degree where it almost feels like it's making fun of the player. As if an NPC walked up to you in the middle of a pacifist run, telling you to go touch some grass. To be clear, these claims about characters not being real are made about darkness specifically, not all the characters of the game, but those concepts are kind of analogous anyway. I'll return to this idea later, just stick with me for now. When I began my research, I held on to the idea that, so far, only Ralsei himself had really said that darkness were not real. Most other characters seem completely oblivious to this idea, and Deltarune itself had not taken a stance on that yet, and when it would surely disagree with Ralsei. I just needed to find evidence for that, which turned out to have been a search for far too simple of an answer and one I wouldn't find. It did lead me into some interesting directions though, and the first thing I chose to consider was Ralsei himself. Looking at how he speaks in the beginning of chapter 3 as well as the Tea Party, Ralsei seems to believe himself to be unworthy of happiness. He has never eaten of his own cakes before. They are for his friends, after all, and even when Susie gets him to try it, despite liking it, he refuses to eat more. His room is eerie and empty. He's not real, so why should he have anything? And when it comes to Susie and Chris almost finding out the prophecy's ending in chapter 4, he would rather go on to do all the future work by himself if it meant the two of them remaining oblivious and happy. They should not worry about him, because he does not matter. The only true purpose of a darkness is to serve lightness, he says. The talk about his empty room reminds me of a depressed person seeing no point in getting out of bed in the morning. The link between a disturbed mental state and a refusal to eat is not that difficult to spot either. I don't think that Ralsei is supposed to literally be clinically depressed and have an eating disorder, but I think that him evoking a general feeling of mental unwellness is intentional. This does not discredit Ralsei on this matter, of course not, but we should keep this aspect of our primary source's mental state in mind. He's not just a computer telling us facts, after all, but a character, and as such, a filter for information. To continue on, I should probably define my terms a bit. You might already be wondering what it even is that I'm contesting here, given that I've been openly referring to Ralsei as a character, as fictional, and yet this is all supposed to be about me refusing to accept that he is not real. So, what do I mean? In the trivial sense and from our perspective, of course darkness are fictional. They are characters in a video game, pixels on a screen, dialogue stored in text files on our computers. That part is obvious. But in some sense they are double fictional, meta-fictional, if you will. Because even within the narrative of Deltarune, in which Chris and Susie are fully real, darkness are still supposedly fictional. In that sense, the jump from, for example, Susie to Ralsei would be like that from the player to Susie, which is to say, one layer of fiction deeper. Here we have reality. It contains everything that you can directly experience. You, me, cats, colors, Deltarune, Toby Fox. The only things it doesn't contain are things that you cannot directly experience. The current king of France, a 16-legged horse, and so on. Do note, however, that the idea of those things does reside in reality. Otherwise I couldn't have just mentioned them or drawn this picture. Now let's zoom in on Deltarune here. Deltarune, aside from video game stuff, contains its reality, the light world, which can be looked at as a world within a world. a sub-reality within our reality which contains characters like Chris and Susie, as well as the school they go to and the dark world. In some sense, you could also say that the idea of Toby Fox exists within this reality in shape of the annoying dog. Again, let's zoom in, this time on the dark world. The dark world is an alternate view of reality within Deltarune. It contains Ralsei, Lancer, Card Castle, video games, and many other things, including, importantly, Chris and Susie. Kind of. The Chris and Susie that exist in the dark world, while very similar to those that exist in the light world, are not the same as them. Chris isn't blue, Susie can't use magic. It's more the idea that exists within the dark world. A representation, an avatar. Like the annoying dog is Toby Fox's avatar. It's the same as how Susie's, Chris's, and Ralsei's video game characters in Chapter 3 are not the same as them, but in-universe representations of them. So with all this, I think what I mean by reality and fiction becomes easy to understand. For any given person, reality is simply the outermost layer of existence that they are aware of. So for Susie, the light world is reality. For you and me, the world that we live in is reality. What makes a layer here is that two things or beings of the same layer can interact with each other directly. The way you can touch a table in your room or Susie can enter the school building. Fiction, then, is simply a world, or layer of existence, within that of the observer. Susie sees a video game she plays as fiction because she knows of at least one layer of reality above it, the one she lives in. In the same way, we see Deltarune as fiction, because it is a world contained within our own. As such, we cannot interact with Susie and Co. directly, but only through this border between us, through the video game. We cannot ever look at Susie herself directly, but only at depictions of her, just as we can only look at pictures of the 16-legged horse. Now we slowly get to the interesting part. Video game Chris, Susie, and Ralsei are all equally real, right? In the same way, I would argue that Ralsei is, at the very least, as real as Dark World Chris and Susie are. But for some reason, Ralsei doesn't seem to think that way. Despite his cakes not being filling to anyone who eats of them, Ralsei insists that Chris and Susie eat when he does not. Why? Remember, for any given person, reality is the outermost layer of existence that they are aware of. Ralsei doesn't think of himself as real, because he is aware of a layer of existence above his own. He knows that he lives in a world within another world, and so his depression makes sense. It's like how many of us might stop thinking of ourselves as real, and might even stop eating or doing anything, if we ever found out that we lived in a simulation, like the Matrix. It could make us feel empty and purposeless, and we might search for meaning in the quote-unquote real world, the one of our creators. This is all kind of stating the obvious, just in different terms, but I think building this framework of understanding is important, because with it we can now see that Ralsei is actually quite an interesting parallel to Flowey. Both aware of layers of existence beyond their own, but coping with that knowledge in very different ways. Where Flowey chooses destruction, nothing matters after all, Ralsei obsesses over wanting others to be happy. If he isn't real, then he has to do everything he can in order to serve those that are. It's his only purpose. The only way that he, despite not being real, can do good in what he sees as true reality, the light world. As such, they are both answers to the question of what if a fictional character realized they were one? And from this, another interesting, foundational difference between the two emerges. That being how deep into fiction they both are planted. Imagine your Toby Fox creating Undertale. Pondering themes of fiction, reality, and buff fish ladies, you realize the only real being that your characters can have a relationship with is the player. That's a problem because you can't write the player, but only write around them. A pretty big creative restriction for your grand thematic explorations and deconstructions, right? So, what do? Well, if you're Toby Fox, you create another game. And you put Undertale into that game, and its players become characters of it as well. And suddenly, you can write them. You call the new game Deltarune, and the Undertale within Deltarune is called the Dark World. Its main players, Chris and Susie, experience the Dark World and interact with its characters like Ralsei and Lancer in quite the same way that we all experienced Undertale and spoke to Sans and Toriel. It's the same thing, just one layer of fiction deeper. Because of this, the dynamic between fictional characters and supposedly real ones can be explored much further in Deltarune than in Undertale, because it does not restrict itself to the same standard that the real characters of that dynamic have to be, quote-unquote, actually real by our standards, but just one layer of existence higher than the fictional ones. The specific dynamic between game and our reality is obviously still explored, mainly via Chris and the player sharing a soul, which actually kind of symbolizes the whole theme here, the bridging between layers of fiction. So yeah, we won't exactly find a simple is Ralsei real yes or no I was looking for when this whole thing started, but we've already gotten some much more satisfying answers out of it, if you ask me. What is clear now is that is Ralsei real was too unspecific of a question to begin with. It's like asking is spaghetti the favorite food? So, is he real? Well, real to whom? We've already discussed his own point of view. Ralsei doesn't see himself as real because he knows a world that contains his own. Beyond that, as far as I'm concerned, there are two more interesting points of view to examine here. The Lightners, i.e. beings one layer of existence above him, and us, the players, beings two layers of existence above him. I think the second one, at least partially, is easier to approach. Because while Darkworld food may be less satiating to Susie than Lightworld food, to us, both are equally unnutritious. Even though Ralsei is one layer of fiction deeper than Susie, they both are still just fictional to us. The Darkworld is still just a world contained within our own. Metafiction isn't more fictional, it's just a different kind of fictional, and so that part is easy. Ralsei is as real to us as Susie is. But then, how real is Susie to us? And, analogously, how real is Ralsei to Susie? And to us? How real is fiction? Put into different terms in order to stay on topic here rather than losing ourselves in random philosophy, how real is the Darkworld? A couple of oddities stood out to me in Ralsei's explanation of darkness, three of which I want to talk about here. 1. What if we could take away the light that wasn't there until we reached another side? If that were to happen, you could start to see things again, and hear them, and feel them. Taking away light that isn't there is obviously kind of nonsense. I know that Gaster said photon reading's negative too, but that doesn't solve the issue. You can't have a negative amount of a physical thing. So there are two options. 1, Ralsei and Gaster are either wrong or heavily oversimplifying, and 2, it's not a physical thing they're talking about. If it's not a physical thing, you could choose to understand photon readings negative and such as nonsense statements, and thereby invitations to not search for a scientific understanding of darkness. In that sense, it's like a superhero, despite being clearly defeated, standing up to the villain once more through the power of friendship and love. That's not supposed to make sense. It's not an explanation, it's an exclamation that this deals with things beyond logic. In some sense, this is probably what the game is going for, but if you want a more literal and less metaphysical explanation, I think there's simply a negative equivalent to photons in this world, and that Gaster's readings indicate an excess of those. Like how measurements of negative electric charge don't indicate a negative number of protons, but just an excess of electrons. But then, aren't the two lines here pretty strange as well? That negative light could somehow allow you to see things makes some intuitive sense, but hear and feel things? All of this could also simply be chalked up to video game logic, but then why does Ralsei specifically make a point of mentioning it? To me, it's pretty clear. Darkness in Deltarune is its own thing, its own physical substance. I'll return to this idea in a bit, but first... 2. That is the Darkworld, Susie. An alternate view of reality through the lens of shadow. In other words, an illusion. Ralsei equates two very different ideas here. An alternate view of reality does not sound the same to me as an illusion at all. It seems the first part is probably true, while the second part is more Ralsei's own interpretation. 3. In other words, when the lights come back on, this world is no longer real. The places you go, the people you meet, none of them are. No longer is a strange choice of words for something that was supposedly never real. To be fair, real is put into quotations here, and I'm not too sure what to make of that. Clearly, Ralsei believes that the Dark Worlds were never actually real, so maybe this is to say that they cease to be the imagined, fictional version of real? As in, you just can't see them anymore when there's light? I guess so, but then how is that different from actual reality, which you can also only see under certain circumstances, that being that there is light? That Dark Worlds are, to some extent, influenced by the Light World has been clear for a while now. Both where in the Light World a Dark Fountain is created and what sorts of items are there influence the contents of the corresponding Dark World. Ralsei, in the beginning of Chapter 3, offers an explanation on how exactly this influence of the Light World on the Dark Worlds works, but I have my issues with it. Supposedly, it all comes down to indistinctness. Just as you can see a monster in the silhouette of a chair, you can see the Dark World, just as long as there's sufficient darkness. It's an illusion, trickery of the mind. But having read his explanation a couple of times, it finally occurred to me that this chair monster comparison is almost completely irrelevant. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be an analogy to what happens in negative light, or whether it's saying that the Dark World is really the same idea taken to its extreme, but clearly neither of those things really make much sense. Because there's objectivity about the Dark World, right? Chris and Susie, for all we can tell, very much seem to see and hear and feel the same things there. quite unlike how you can see a monster in the silhouette of a chair. Ask another person to look and they might or might not see a monster too, but it certainly won't be the same as yours. All the chair example really says is that things are indistinct in low light, and that when things are indistinct, our imagination takes over. That's it. Ralsei uses this comparison to show how the dark world, just like the chair monster, is fantasy, imagined, born from indistinctness. But the dark world is not indistinct, not at all, and the mechanics of darkness just don't align with those of fantasy. Clearly, Ralsei's explanation of darkness isn't wrong, but it isn't an explanation of the dark world specifically. To make sense of all this, I began sketching out some graphs based on the information we have. This is the first one I made. Since both the dark and the light world offer great clarity, there are 2 points of peak distinctness. Looking at this, I first thought, oh, it loops around, but I don't think this is the best explanation. Because I realized that distinctness in the light and dark world is actually mirrored along the zero light axis. And this is the revised graph I made in face of that realization. Again, I think all this makes a bit more sense if you think of darkness as its own substance here, rather than just the absence of light, but this should still work in that way of thinking with some minor adjustments. Anyway, here's what the graph depicts. You need a given amount of light and/or darkness in order to see things properly. Specifically, in order to see the light world, you need a mix of both, which is probably what Ralsei means with the balance between light and darkness, which I think is pretty cool. To see the dark world clearly, you just need a good amount of darkness. Too much and it becomes overwhelming, crushing. Too little and the picture isn't fully formed yet. As Ralsei says, when darkness increases, you could start to see things again. The picture is only beginning to form. Toward the 2 extremes, you are either overwhelmed by light or crushed by darkness, both blinding you. In the 2 sweet spots, you can see perfectly well, and toward the middle, where there's no light and just a medium amount of darkness, you can see nothing. There obviously isn't enough light for you to actually see anymore, but there isn't enough darkness yet for your imagination to fully take over either. Your mind can't make anything out of nothing. In reference to the rest of Ralsei's explanation, means something like your imagination is missing a starting point, something to base itself on, to latch onto. Any creative will tell you that coming up with an idea out of thin air is basically impossible. You need something to modify and adapt, something to inspire you. As the chair example shows, darkness aids fantasy by making things less distinct, less objective. With light, there's certainty. Things are the way you see them, leaving little room for imagination. A bit of darkness creates gaps between the light for your mind to fill with its own ideas. It's like an armature to sculpt clay onto. It gives you direction, but you fill in the shape yourself. If there's total darkness, then there's no armature, and your clay falls down and you cannot properly shape it. At the same time, if the armature is too specific, too detailed, equivalent to the distinctness of light, then there's no more room for creative freedom with the clay. Now, a crushing amount of darkness, the dark world's equivalent to total darkness, is stated to be the manifestation of the fear of dark. Kind of unrelated to all this, but Deltarune works on multiple layers of meaning simultaneously, so nothing here means just one thing. And so, crushing darkness also represents an inability to create. Again, just like in regular darkness, it is due to a lack of structure. But this time, it doesn't hinder us from creating at all, but from creating purposefully. If we didn't, at least sometimes, return to the orderly structure of daytime, our dreams would be filled with chaotic nonsense. It would be an excess of ideas, just thoughts inspiring more thoughts, and everything is thrown together, and nothing would be coherent anymore. Nothing would fit together, and so all the darkness would turn to stone, because their fantasy would cease to be believable. If there's just the right amount of darkness, however, not too little, not too much, something very, very interesting happens. We begin to see again, but without any of the forceful certainty and objectivity that comes with light. Our fantasy gets a starting point, but no restraints. There's an armature again, and so it can be built upon, but even the armature itself is as moldable as clay, and so our minds are free. In this sense, the dark world is a mirror to the light world, as fiction is a mirror to us. It allows us to see ourselves, but without the restraining certainty of reality. It's unhindered expression. You look into the mirror and see without light. Without light, all the cages around you turned invisible and even the image of your real, currently existing self not to be seen. All you see is yourself. Your truest self. One not bound by having to exist in this world. A cat that wasn't caged, and so it grew to the size of a tiger. That's why Susie can become a hero in this world. She was a bully in the light world, made such by the facts of her life. But set free by darkness, no longer shackled by what is true and real, she can invent herself anew. Same for Bertley. Initially, just as Susie first ran rampant in the Dark World, the lack of objectivity freed his vanity. But then it freed him from his need for it. From seeing the things in the world that made him think he ever needed it. We also see the same thing happening for Noelle. She beats her fear of mice and becomes generally less fearful, and she learns to stand up to authority. One last example of this plays into how Chris is Kara, but I will address that whole insanity in a future video. Dark worlds represent art. This is one of the easiest Deltarune interpretations to arrive at, but I don't think I really understood what it meant until now. The message conveyed through this concept wasn't clear to me before. It was just, hey, you can create worlds within your imagination and go on adventures. Isn't that cool? But now it speaks to me. And it says something about the nature of humans and how we relate to art. Of how art can show us a reflection of ourselves and let us see things that cannot be seen. Had you grown up in a room with only red light, you would appear red and think that you were. Art puts us into new rooms, to examine ourselves in, to see ourselves from different angles, and to allow us to reinvent ourselves into humbler, braver and kinder versions of ourselves. And so, is Ralsei real? To me, he is as real as anything outside my own reality ever could be. And he is as real as art. So yeah, that's my first video. If I wasn't clear enough anywhere or said something confusing, please don't hesitate to ask. I'd be happy to elaborate. This video could easily have been an hour long, but I tried to be a bit more reasonable. Either way, feel free to tell me that I'm just coping because I want Ralsei to be real. I probably am. And I'm more than happy to accept that this interpretation of mine is perhaps more a reflection of its author than its object. It is an example of its own thesis on art. Anyway, I'll go play Deltarune now and make some more videos. Bye bye.